Very briefly, our team is Frida, Rion, Taeyang, Matt, Pulat, myself, Rezvan, and Jen Singer, who couldn't make it today. The context is the client side, and then the SIPA team side on the right. We have an interesting kind of client structure. So primarily we're consulting directly to the East-West Management Institute, who is effectively our primary client. They're an international kind of non-for-profit institution building organization that is consulting to the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, who has a permanent presence in Rwanda at the Ministry of Trade and Industry. So at the end of the day, our end of day client is the Rwanda Ministry of Trade and Industry. The SIPA team on the right-hand side, you can see in the 2011-2012 team that would have been presenting here a year ago to you, started off with some really interesting work. They wrote an industrial policy paper to assist with some kind of interesting recommendations. They also created an essential oils value chain analysis to look for identify opportunities for development of that industry. And thirdly, they also started the development of an industrial indicator dashboard to provide some visibility on what was happening in the country. What we've done is picked up some of that work and created some new things. So you're going to follow kind of 1, 2, and 3 work streams from here on out. The first one is we created an inventory of all value chain analyses that have been done in Rwanda from all different types of industries and sectors. We'll go into some more detail on that. The second one is we created a new end-to-end maize value chain analysis. The third piece is we improved and implemented the industrial indicator dashboard. So we picked off where they were, made some refinements, and have collected the data for the first couple of years. So here's a list of all the different outputs that we created inside these work streams. So it was a range of different things that we had to create to enable each of these work streams. So the first one on the value chain inventory, we're calling it, we have a catalog of these with some kind of ways of measuring whether these value chains were actually good ones or not, which we'll go into detail. And also we're producing a CD with these 49 value chains that we've got, a range of PDF documents, that will be put on the ministry's website for access. And this is the hope of this, that will create visibility for the Rwandan government and for other stakeholders so they know what has been done and what hasn't. The second piece is kind of end-to-end, or this seed to stomach is a crude way of explaining it. We've created, it's the first end-to-end maize value chain analysis done in Rwanda. So there's been pieces on the agricultural piece and pieces maybe on processing, but we've done it from end-to-end. And that's like a 40-page kind of maize analysis. We've also mapped the entire value chain in a kind of a PowerPoint kind of view. And it was the first time the ministry has seen all of this in one view. And the third was a value distribution model. So value chains are about identifying what the value add is at each point in the process, and we have an Excel model that kind of helps them figure that out. The third one is on the industrial indicators. We'll again go into more detail on that, but the high-level view is we've kind of syndicated, arranged, agreed, and formalized 17 high-level indicators in order for the ministry to track their progress, and a presentation that helps them. We created a presentation to help navigate that decision-making process, because it was about a facilitation with some key stakeholders. And thirdly, there's an actual Word report on the industrial indicators that shows what we did, what our methodology was, and what the results have been. So we completed these 3 work streams over 4 months in a bit of detail, and in 2 kind of pieces of in-country research. The first team in January and the second in March. The January team, again across the 3 work streams, started off kind of gathering some initial data, and I think the most interesting part of the first trip was deciding in consultation with the client that maize was the value chain that we were actually going to conduct. So there's other options, maybe bananas or tomatoes or whatever it was, but maize was the one we selected. The second team in March was then able to go into more detail. On maize particularly, the second work stream there, we conducted upwards of 40 interviews with farmers, with farmer co-ops, with government officials, with processors, millers, with finance credit providers, with kind of like some of the big buyers like the World Food Program, etc. So what we're going to do is just go into a bit of detail, show you some of our key findings across the 3 work streams. And I'm handing over to you.
Thank you, Rezvan. Well, first of all, what is a value chain? Value chain is, and why is actually so important and so popular in recent years. Value chain is a map of the steps in the production of a final product, starting from resources, producing, trading, retail, and exporting. It also allows value chain actors such as producers, processors, buyers, sellers, and consumers to add value to each link of the chain. Value chain has proved to be very important in providing enough important information for policy making and intervention opportunities. And it also has proved to indicate the constraints in the growth, in the industrial growth. So typically the initiators, producer of the value chain and the development are either government or development agencies. So looking at Rwanda value chain, we found that there is no compiled database of inventory of the existing value chains. And additionally, the majority of the value chains, they are lacking the scope, the deep analysis, and also there is no constraint analysis of prioritized recommendations. And finally, there is no contact list that would indicate the producer of the value chain, and there is no mechanism of tracking and updating the system. So what our team did, we actually did 3 outputs regarding the inventory in Rwanda. So we compiled a list of comprehensive inventory of 49 value chains along 11 industries produced in the recent 10 years. Secondly, we did a quality control system, which is based on the measurements of scope and value chain analysis. And finally, we did a value chain, a list of value chain producers and the recommendations regarding updating and tracking it. So just to go a little bit over the control system, it's actually based, what we did, we based it on 4 benchmarks. The first is the value chain scope, denoting if there is an end-to-end analysis, a deep analysis, starting, let's say, from, in agriculture, as an example, sector, we can say from the producer, as a farmer, up to the consumer. Secondly, it's a profit distribution, if the value chain actually has a value addition and pricing through the whole analysis. Thirdly, it's a constraint analysis, and finally, it's a recommendation relevant to the value chain. So, according to the graph, as you can see, so what we found that a lot of the value chains that exist in Rwanda, they actually they do not have this deep analysis of as a scope of the analysis of the value chain. So, for example, only 27 out of 49 value chains they have deep analysis, and only 21 out of 49 have profit distribution. And what we're trying. The reason why we found it so important, because we found that in value chain it has to be shown each step of the production, and that's actually going to give you more value and base for your constraints and recommendations. So I'm going to hand it over to Matt.
Yeah. So in addition to the inventory, we also created a brand new original end-to-end value chain on maize. Maize was selected, we were directed that way from the ministry for a number of reasons. The first of these is that farmers are transitioning away from subsistence farming into commercial farming. So this is sort of a very dynamic time in Rwanda. Farmers are moving to a sort of a more market approach to their agriculture. At the same time, there have been very high levels of intervention by the government in the agricultural sector. There's been a very intensive crop intensification program. The government is launching a number of programs to try and push farmers into this market mentality and sort of increase their yields. And there's a real need to see sort of how effective that's actually been. That's where the value chain comes in. As we've already said, there is currently no comprehensive end-to-end analysis on maize. There are value chains that talk about strictly the agricultural side of maize. So we'll talk about what's the value addition that farmers create as they grow the corn and sell it in market. But what happens after that was still largely a mystery. There are lots of things you can do with maize. You can mill it, you can make flour out of it, you can make oil, you can make a number of different products. But that side of the analysis was actually lost. And finally, it's a very high value crop in terms of food security. This was a big concern for the Rwandan government. They actually have very large sort of strategic reserves of maize. They see it as sort of the answer to making sure that Rwandans are fed. And at the same time, it's also an opportunity to increase farmer profits and livelihoods. So they saw it as sort of a win-win. Our approach to creating the value chain, we first engaged in some desk research. We did focus groups in field, and then we conducted about 55 interviews with different stakeholders. So we would go to people who were involved in the production of maize. We would go to various people who oversee and sort of analyze the whole process. We tried to get everyone's point of view on this particular production. We also identified sort of what we thought as benchmark maize value chain analyses to guide us in how we should think about this problem and ultimately draft our report. At the end of the day, we approached a 1 kilogram approach to our value chain analysis. So what we did is we followed 1 kilogram of maize kernels or seeds through the whole process and figured out who adds how much value at each step as that goes to market. So if it's made into flour, how much value addition is actually created by the miller when he mills the grain into flour. When it's seed, how much value addition does the farmer actually make as he grows that into a product that he can sell. That was sort of the guiding thread to our value chain analysis. Finally, we also were very interested in constraints. It wasn't enough to figure out sort of what the status quo is. We also wanted to know why it's that way. So what are the things that are holding back farmers from increasing their value, from producing a higher quality product or more of it? What's holding millers back from either making a better product or milling more efficiently? The actual report that we produced was composed of 2 units. We had a descriptions section where we started to describe the status quo within Rwanda, a bit of background information, the status of production and consumption, what their trade environment is like, and then step 2 was more sort of our recommendations. How can they improve? What's holding people back? Which we'll get to. Our first step was to actually sort out and map the maize value chain. So this was primarily the work of the January team. They would go to pretty much everyone who's involved in the process and try and determine how maize is produced and into what products in Rwanda. This is actually rather exciting for the Ministry of Trade. They were very excited to see this particular slide because no one had ever actually graphically represented the entire maize production maize production process in Rwanda. So we felt that was a pretty big value addition. Once we had done that, we actually went back in March and tried to figure out, given how the value chain works, how much do the various actors add at each step. So we would go to people, calculate their input costs, what they sold things at, and how much sort of value addition they actually earn. As you can see, actually farmers actually create the most value addition out of maize. They make about 177 francs per kilogram. That, however, is largely sort of recompense for how intensive it is to make maize. A lot of that is sort of absorbed by their wages as sort of recompense for what they make as their end product. We also did this for a number of different stakeholders. Some millers actually produce much higher value added than others, so some are more efficient. Some farmers have much higher yields and much higher valuation. Once we'd done that, we started to think about constraints and our recommendations. So given the state of the value chain of maize in Rwanda, how could it be improved? We found that a number of the ministries weren't sharing data, and they were simply not coordinating their efforts. That sort of manifest in our project itself. We were trying to do a value chain on maize, which involves agriculture and it involves industry milling. Neither of those two ministries, there's a Ministry of Trade, there's a Ministry of Agriculture, neither of them sort of cooperated on that project. So it was an opportunity for us to sort of try and bring them all together. Our second recommendation was to strengthen maize farmer cooperatives. Rwanda is using a cooperative-based approach to agricultural development. It's their way to try to change farmer mentalities, get them away from subsistence farming. It's also a way to very quickly educate them on what are the best farming techniques, and also to provide them with facilities that they couldn't afford on their own. It's really a very big cross-cutting sort of strategy. We felt it's very important, particularly to address post-harvest losses. About 22% of a farmer's value in maize is lost as it sits out of the field and is waiting to be taken to market. Most of it rots. A good amount of it sort of gets insects or gets wet. and it doesn't fetch as high prices of good. We also recommend addressing credit availability primarily for working capital for millers. There are many millers in Rwanda who could do a lot more with the machines and men that they have at their fingertips, but they can't actually get enough money or get enough credit to purchase enough maize kernels to work at full capacity. So there's a very large public-private miller in Rwanda that has state-of-the-art milling machines, but only functions at about 60% capacity, simply because it can't afford to actually buy enough maize to run at full capacity. We also recommended diversifying, looking into sort of new maize products that may fetch higher prices on the market. Most millers just produce maize flour, and they may sell the residue as either animal feed or fertilizer. One of the reasons that some maize millers are so much more successful than others is that they've diversified into other products. So they make things like grits and bran that can be used in, for example, beer products. Finally, we recommended sort of improving enforcement of certification. There's only one maize miller in Rwanda that's actually certified to mill maize. All the rest sort of work without any sort of government certification. That's a problem on both ends because those that aren't certified are still obviously selling their maize. So there's no demand for higher quality maize. The people aren't demanding it, and suppliers aren't producing it. If we sort of step up the certification process and provide better maize to people, or better maize to consumers, we'll have a higher value addition at the end of the day. So that was, in a nutshell, our value chain. I'll turn it over to the statistical indicators.
Thanks, Matt. So this part of our project, this third work stream about industrial indicators, takes a little bit of a step back to kind of evaluate how Rwanda is doing on the whole in terms of industry and trade. The purpose of the indicator dashboard is really to serve as a snapshot for the senior management of the Ministry of Trade and Industry, perhaps the Minister, the Permanent Secretary, etc., to just have a quick status of key indicators that tell them a little bit about what's going on in that area. So our objectives were to take what the 2011 team did, kind of take a look at those indicators, prioritize them, and actually populate the data. And also, secondly, to make sure that there was a process in place for doing this on an ongoing basis. And to do that, we wanted to evaluate what are the tools needed, what's the management infrastructure like, are there any incentives for doing this? Before we could get there, however, we wanted to make sure that indicators that were on this dashboard were aligned to current Rwanda strategy. So we took a look at their Vision 2020 goals, their economic development and poverty reduction strategy, and a number of other strategies to make sure that these indicators are actually aligned with where Rwanda wants to go in the future. We also researched some international best practices by UNIDO, as well as consultations with a number of different stakeholders, not just in the Ministry of Trade, but with the Statistics Bureau, with the National Bank, all these people who we're actually gathering data from, and the data was quite dispersed. So in the end, we ended up prioritizing 17 indicators. The first 10 of which have currently been populated with data. Some of these are key outlets such as industrial growth, exports, capacity utilization, employment, and infrastructure. There are 7 additional ones that are yet to be populated, but we have the data for investment and credit and how that affects manufacturing and mining and industry. And in addition to that, because we want this to be forward-looking, we're not concerned about just how they're doing today, but what are the upgrading factors that they need to consider in the future? Have they considered institutional support and the climate, knowledge and skills, and the external environment? How much does it cost? So in the final analysis, because we're out of time, this is what the dashboard looks like. As again, like a car's dashboard, it's meant to be a quick snapshot. You can see what's going on immediately in any of those areas. And on the right-hand side is kind of a fast stats section where you can see from the year before to this year, has there been an increase or a decrease in in that particular indicator. So that is the conclusion of our presentation. We would like to thank so many people who helped us out today. Our East-West Management Institute, our clients, for being there for us. SIPA, of course, the ministry, along with many of our stakeholders that we consulted. And Professor Norman, who could not be here today. So thank you very much, everyone.
So I'm curious, you mentioned about the value chain analysis that has already been done. Who's doing these value chain analyses, and in lieu of the fact that, or because of the fact that you pointed out that they're not doing those first two steps which seem critical to the value chain, I think it was distribution, product distribution, and end-to-end. How are they making accurate recommendations, and are they actually making incorrect or damaging recommendations in the value chains if they're not doing them properly?
Well, first of all, the producer of the value chains, as I already mentioned, is mostly development agencies or government agents. There are a couple of private firms in Rwanda that are actually doing value chain analysis as well. And regarding the profit distribution and the scope, yes, it's true. It's a lot of them. They cover only one section of the map. For example, they just look at the farmers' value, or sometimes there are some value chains that are looking only at the trade. So we're not necessarily saying that these are bad value chains. We just did this equality system, identifying if it has all these 4 benchmarks. So I wouldn't say that the damaging value chains is just a different outlook of work.
Can I just add that it's probably not necessarily that there's like damaging recommendations, but that vague recommendations can potentially be, zero help. So the idea is that if you do these 4 things, then you're probably going to be a lot more helpful and specific in exactly what needs to be done.
There's also the issue of just limited resources. It takes a bit more time to make the actual profit distribution. So I know that our client, the ministry, actually made a few series of value chains without a profit distribution, just because they didn't have a lot of time to work on it. So.
Sorry, can I ask you a question? Absolutely, yeah. So it seems like a lot of you guys' recommendations depend on adoption by different government officials. So for example, cooperation between the Agriculture Ministry and the Trade Ministry, or the adoption of this industrial indicators that you guys created. So I was wondering if you guys have thought about the implementation portion of it and how you're going to coach them through it.
Yeah, exactly. Do you want to talk about the indicators?
Sure. So that was a particularly interesting part for us, a little complicated, because once we got there, we understood that there are a number of existing processes in place already as far as the indicators go. They have a number of different dashboards going on in the Ministry of Planning. So it was having the discussions with the people who were actually involved in the day-to-day implementation to understand what was the value of this particular dashboard and where was it going to be integrated in what they already had. So for instance, they have a monthly, there's a plan for a monthly, quarterly, and an annual dashboard. This would fit into the annual perspective, kind of like the annual report. And implementation-wise, it was great because having some of these meetings with the people who held the data at the National Statistics Bureau, etc., allowed me to facilitate some of the introductions that the person actually collecting the data would need. So he came along with me on all of those meetings and met some of these people and made those contacts so that he could continue to have this ongoing stream of data.
2 quick questions. The first would be, knowing Rwanda, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on the women's role in the value chain. So where women add value throughout the value chain, given the percentage of women farmers. And also another thing is, in terms of biofuel. So I wonder why that wasn't one of your recommendations as a diversification, as an output. Because particularly with the Vision 2020, looking at sustainability as one of the critical pieces of Rwanda going forward, it seems like it would be a really simple way of using some of the byproducts and looking at a zero carbon aspect of the maize production process. And then I was also interested in just getting a little bit of your understandings, because I know it's been a really rewarding experience for you guys. So, and I know you found out some pretty cool things about what the government's doing in terms of social impact in the value chain. So I'd love to hear any thoughts about that.
I can answer the biofuels. Okay, so I'll answer the biofuels one. So just because of the shortness of the presentation, I mean, part of our kind of constraints analysis highlighted, climate issues, and also on the kind of diversification of products piece. There's a range of different, areas that we see that there are constraints to diversification. So you have to unblock certain things before you can just start a new industry. So it would have taken us a significant amount of time to do cost-benefit analyses for a range of different products. And so we suggested that these are the kind of 5 or 6 products that they then consider doing those analyses on, and one of them is biofuels. So we think that they should think about those things. We did not think it was appropriate for us to answer that question yet.
And actually, would like to add about that. It's, one of the constraints about starting with the biofuels is because there is not enough supply of maize in Rwanda. So it's right now primarily it's going just for the local consumption. So yes, it is a great diversification product, but at the same time, I think currently it might not be an option for Rwanda.
Women in the value chain, I'm not sure if I'm the best person to answer this, but since being the token woman up here, I will try, and feel free to add on, either of you guys. But I think women are an integral part of the value chain. Many of them, we spoke to many women farmers who gave us their perspective of how they did everything throughout the whole process. They're integral to everything. I don't know if I would necessarily pull them out in any way.
For example?
Yeah, I mean, we visited one large farm, and there is a really large cooperatives, and one woman actually is doing some accounting job. So they are distribute the jobs in farming the maize, and among farmers, most of them are men. For the accounting and some calculating jobs, the woman is doing actually, and a lot of millers are actually women as well. So I think.
Yeah, actually, one of the largest milling cooperatives that we visited was actually run by a woman, at least the local one in Kigali. So it's very impressive.
And it's also integrated in the Vision 2020 of Rwanda, so that women are highly recommended to be involved in the industry.
But this is agriculture related, but just for your information, Rwanda is the country that has most represented women in parliament in the world. So
the US can learn something.
Yes, it's part of the president's agenda to promote gender equality. It may be useful, since you all are resources on value chain analyses, that FAO, I think, it's FAO or IFA, has a toolkit for incorporating a gender perspective in value chain analysis. And so probably, especially in the agriculture sector, it would make sense, to be recommending that there be some systematic consideration of that, because certainly when you're making certain policy recommendations, especially in terms of organizing cooperatives, there may or may not be social norms that will inhibit women's participation, where they may be active in some sectors or some parts, some roles, and not in others. On the farmer cooperative recommendation, from your presentation, we gather that this is part of the government's agenda, so very much a top-down recommendation to promote cooperatives, but we all know that there's been very mixed experience in different countries with cooperatives. Did you get a sense from your interviews with stakeholders that there's interest among farmers in further strengthening, in participating in cooperatives, that this is not just a top-down effort by the government, but that also has bottom-up support?
Everything in Rwanda is a top-down effort. I think that's the starting point. So it's difficult to find a farmer who has just voluntarily done something necessary. Even the maize is kind of part of the food security top-down approach, right? Cooperatives seem to be definitely part of the strategy, and I think there were a range of different reasons that showed that farmers that were in cooperatives were significantly more successful than farmers that were not. It was because of access to technology, economies of scale, decreased risk, access to credit. I mean, there was a range of different things. Matt, do you want to add?
Yeah, actually the process to make a cooperative in Rwanda is farmers sort of voluntarily organize themselves. And then they've been asked to be certified by the government that they're a legitimate cooperative. So there is, the cooperatives are growing, so I think there's a real interest on the farmer side of things in participating in this. With respect to sort of how cooperatives function, we do think that, particularly on the farmer side of things, they solve a number of problems. It's a very sort of cross-cutting strategy, so it can address post-harvest losses, it can move people away from subsistence agriculture, it can link people with the market. It does a lot of very good things. That said, cooperatives are still kind of in their infancy in Rwanda. So when we spoke to millers, many times there was a concern as to how reliable existing cooperatives actually were. So there were problems with the organization. You would have someone who would represent the cooperative and promise to deliver X amount of maize kernels by a certain date. That was completely infeasible. That just couldn't be done with the resources he had at hand. So we recommend sort of letting them mature. We think that they're probably a step in the right direction for Rwanda. There should just be more of them and of higher quality.
Just to add to that, we actually unfortunately didn't have a chance to talk to too many farmers outside of the cooperatives, but there were a few that we did speak to, and the plus side is that they do receive some of the same subsidies that farmers in the cooperatives receive, but on the downside there are some things that they don't have access to. So for instance, we visited a facility in Naksho that was sponsored by the government that had access to a large-scale irrigation system that farmers outside of the cooperative did not necessarily have access to. So part of our recommendations were to consider, what kind of solutions are available for people outside of the cooperatives. Should they investigate smaller scale improvements to irrigation and start to think about some of those solutions as well. So we did try to address that, but we didn't have as much information as we wanted.
Another constraint that we faced or learned on the ground was that farmers' access to microcredit, because this concept is relatively new. So not just maize, but overall agricultural products. One of the stakeholders we talked to was local microfinance bank, and they said this concept of just borrowing money from the bank for agricultural production is new. And one of the interesting programs the government introduced is they built this texting system. So if the farmers texted this number, they would receive the local price level of the maize domestically. So it's mainly top-down model, but the government is trying to balance it out by introducing that kind of program, so farmers get relevant information for their production.
What percentage of farmers are part of cooperatives? And of the cooperatives, can you give me a sense of how big they are, like how much they produce, and of that they produce, what percentage of it is maize versus other crops?
It was very hard to get information on that.
We got a number, but we don't trust it.
It's true. So we got a number. We think about half, more or less, of farmers are actually in cooperatives at the moment. So it's been very successful. But again, we're not entirely confident in that number. The process is basically, from the government's point of view, they have a bunch of cooperatives. They don't keep the best. They don't have access to sort of the best information on each individual cooperative.
I believe there's a study going on right now to actually quantify that, right? But it's not complete yet.
But we know production, right? So we know that in terms of production of maize, we know at least one cooperative or an association of produces something like 60% of the maize. So
That's on the milling side of things.
sorry, this is just on the milling side, not on the agriculture.
No.
Ah, so we don't know what the number is on the agricultural piece, just on the processing. So the process, so some of them, that's interesting, is some cooperatives just do the agricultural piece, and some do the kind of from the agriculture all the way to the processing too. So
there's tons of different cooperatives in Rwanda. I mean, there are credit cooperatives, there are milling cooperatives, there are farming cooperatives. They're pretty much like cooperatives for almost every economic activity. It's really what the government's approach is.
And one of the larger farming cooperatives that we spoke to had about 300 members, so that was just to give you an example, but that's kind of an extreme. I'm not really sure what the smaller.
Yeah.
Do you guys just have an idea of whether or not the cooperatives are run, the producer cooperatives, are they run as owner cooperatives? So is there asset, and how are the dividends shared? Is there a one vote per member, or do you have any idea on how the democratic governance systems of
So there is a representative for each cooperative. I mean, they do sort of elect their leaders. I'm not sure like what the typical practice is in terms of do you get a vote based on like how big your land is or something like that. The model that we understand is that cooperatives will buy maize kernels from the individual farmers and then sell it at the market. So they almost sort of work like a bit of a middleman. But I mean, again, like the process can be very different from cooperative to cooperative. There are some that have sort of leaders that may not even represent any real farmers. Like there are cases where you have sort of like ghost cooperatives, where someone almost like pretends to represent people. So it's very hit or miss, I think.
Well, thanks for a great presentation. Thanks very much. Great presentation.